So in a previous video, we showed the new MSI X299 motherboards over on the other side of this booth, and those included some changes to the MSI M.2 heat shields that we previously looked at. They've been revamped quite a bit, actually. We talked about those in that video. I'll recap it a bit here, but they have another response to the M.2 thermals, and that is this add-in card. Before getting to that, this video is brought to you by Corsair and their new Vengeance RGB LED memory, which has hand-selected ICs for overclocking, and you can find more in the link in the description below on that. So they've got an AIC, and as you can see here, it actually sockets two M.2 SSDs, and they support the full form factor 2280 form factor SSDs. And then the interesting part is, aside from the storage aspect, which we'll talk about in a moment, there's a small fan here to provide some cooling. So this is the biggest problem with the M.2 SSDs. Now, a few notes on this. If you're not up to speed on how M.2 SSDs and thermals work, generally speaking, overheating is not a problem. However, if you're doing really constant, like steady state workloads, especially big sequential transfers, particularly in a RAID, it can become a problem. It is pretty uncommon though. That said, some of the motherboards don't really help with the temperatures in a way that makes any sense. So this would assist by moving the SSDs onto an AIC. You socket it into a PCIe by 8 slot, so it's an X8 on the PCIe, and then that gives you full bandwidth and throughput to the devices while providing some cooling through here. There's a little on-off switch over here as well, which I believe might be for the fan, but this is a pre-production model. In addition to the two M.2 SSDs on the back side of the card, there's a 2.5-inch SSD or hard drive slot. You'd probably put a hard drive in there realistically. Now, why you would put one there, I'm not 100% clear on yet. It might be worth trying out, but either way, there's a slot back there. There's the bandwidth to support it if it's just a hard drive anyway, so they've got one there. For cooling, the fan spins, blows air through, goes across the normal heat sinks that they call the M2 shield. Assuming these have the same change as the motherboards, which I'm not clear if they do, if they have the same change as the motherboards, there would be a 3mm thick thermal pad there with a higher watt per meter Kelvin or thermal conductivity rating than on the previous pads that we looked at for the original MSI M.2 heat shield. So that's some changes that are relevant. So it blows across there, goes out the back of the case, and covers your thermals. The reason that something like this would make sense if you do happen to use those steady state workloads with a higher throughput that causes thermal issues or throttling or whatever, would be because with the normal heat shields or heat sinks or whatever you call it on the motherboards, normally heat gets trapped underneath, particularly with double-sided M.2 SSDs, and there are quite a few of those, like the Patriot Hellfire, for example. So when the heat is synced through the top, it really doesn't do you a lot of good if you have no direct airflow over the heatsink and no airflow under the SSD where all the heat is just racking up and getting stuck there. So that would solve that. Now, to go back to the motherboards, we talked about that briefly at the beginning of this and more detail in the motherboard video, but just to cover that for the sake of the name of this video, the motherboards have a few new types of heat sinks. One of them is called Frozers. They're naming it a Frozer line, second generation. These were the first generation, the one under here. The Frozer heat sinks are made of aluminum. They're a little bit thicker. They don't have fins or anything to speak of, but they've got a better thermal pad on there in theory. Now technically, I will say, despite having a 3mm thick thermal pad, you generally want a smaller one because it's less area to transfer through. You really don't want to have a big thermal interface like thermal paste or thermal pads between your metal. But the reason you would have a thicker one is to make sure you can accommodate all the different types of SSDs because they're really not standardized to any reasonable expectation. So they've got the changes to the motherboards, they've got the changes to this. The motherboard version, still no direct airflow, but it's just a better heatsink overall, so we'll be looking at that in more detail after Computex. For now though, check the channel for other coverage. We're going to be looking at some of the video cards from MSI, including the Lightning. Already looked at the X299 motherboards, and subscribe for more. Go to patreon.com/gamersnext to help us out directly. Thank you for watching. I'll see you all next time.